What's up, YouTube? It's the Action Figure Grader coming back to you with something a little different for the channel. I thought today we would take a look at loose graded Star Wars action figures and do a comparison of the grading cases for the big three companies. The big three being Collector Archive Services, CAS, Action Figure Authority, which is AFA, and then UK Graders, which is UKG. And I put together kind of a small sampling here of their cases for loose graded figures. And I'm going to give you my opinions as to who I think has the best cases. And then at the end, we're also going to take a look at baggie presentations. Vintage Kenner baggies, mail-away baggies, things like that. And what I consider to be the best in terms of the best presentation for a lot of these items. And again, I'm not going to say that I'm right. I'm not going to say that if you have a different opinion than me, that that we can't get along. So we all have different tastes. I'm just going to give you my personal opinions on some of these grading cases. Now that all three companies are kind of up to date with their cases, UKG was the last to kind of join the laser cut kind of cases with these cool new accessory kind of presentations. AFA is they came out with new cases, I think in towards the end or fall of 2019. And then CAS has had changes to their cases as well over the years. And I'm going to give you the pluses and minuses of each case, some of the trends I'm seeing with cases, breaking, things like that. So I think without further ado, let's go ahead and dig right in. So I want to show this one first. This is a Polish bootleg Zuckuss or Forlom, depending on how you want to call them. But this is from this was a 2019 case. And one thing I do like about CAS's labels is that nowadays, they do include the year as to what year this was graded. So this is from over 3 years ago. And this is how CAS used to present these larger weapons. It's a really nice kind of etched accessory style recessed case for these weapons. This is my preference in terms of how they present them. But for whatever reason, CAS has moved away from those. I'm thinking it's because of time and because it's less expensive to just put brackets on them. So this one is a case from last year. This is a no COO Zuckuss license figure, CAS 85 plus. And so this is how typically CAS does it now with these larger weapons and larger accessories, things like things like these larger Zuckuss rifles. And in my opinion, I don't like the way this presents as well, just because this one doesn't do it as bad. But for some of the cases I've seen, the weapons kind of slide around inside those brackets. And, I also don't particularly like the fact that it's at an angle like that versus this one, which to me is a much cleaner presentation. CAS is also the only company to use J-hooks for holding the figure in place. In general, I tend to prefer the J-hooks. I know I go back and forth because the other two companies, AFA and UKG, use rounded dowels around the neck to hold the figure in place. And I go back and forth on it as to what I like better. But when done correctly, I tend to prefer the J-hooks. I just think it's a nice presentation, and it keeps the figure nice and secure. When I say done correctly, it's just that. Because sometimes when you get back figures from CAS, the figure rattles a little bit. This one has got a little bit of rattle to it. This one doesn't have any rattle whatsoever. And I think it's easier to make these J-hooks for licensed figures because, in general, the licensed figures are all about the same. It's pretty uniform, pretty homogeneous in terms of the size of the figures. So J-hooks on those figures make a lot of sense. With bootlegs, there's so much variation depending on the generation, if it's a Polish bootleg. And, the casting process for making these bootlegs is not exact. It's a lot more rudimentary. So you're going to have a little bit more rattle only because they're not exactly the same. Now, my experience has been in terms of getting these items back from CAS, I have not had one breakage for any loose figure. And so that's been my experience since I've been starting sending stuff to them in 2018, 2017, something like that. I've never had a case for loose graded figures ever come back broken. And the other thing I'll point out with CAS that I like a lot that the other two companies don't do is that they use little kind of like foot platforms for the figures. And I tend to like that. I think it's a cleaner presentation. This is how they used to do it, and I think they still do it sometimes for bootleg figures, or it just depends on the figure. But I like this kind of foot platform the best. It's kind of a double platform there that keeps the figure in place. This is the more common presentation where it's got, kind of a small foot peg that goes inside the little foot peg hole, and it's got a little mini platform to it. So I like that a lot. I think that really kind of holds it in place. It's a little bit easier to kind of get the figure to fit properly, things like that. So, the CAS loose cases in general, I tend to like a lot. We're going to come back to them as it relates to sabers in a little while, but that in general is how I feel about CAS cases. In general, I like them a lot. There's a lot of positives to them. I don't like the brackets on the loose, kind of larger weapons. And IG-88 is an example of that. So this is an AFA graded example, AFA 85 gray body IG-88 Hong Kong. This is how they present the two weapons for IG-88 that he came with, the long rifle and the Imperial Blaster. I like the recessed cases like this. Now, even CAS with these weapons, even as small as these weapons are, they use brackets, and I don't like that. They just rattle around and move around. This is a much cleaner presentation. It's smaller. The cases don't take up as much room. And, in general, I like the way that AFA uses these kind of recessed cases on most of their weapons. They don't use recessed cases for the Sand People gaffy stick. They did it for a little while. They had recessed cases, and then they moved back over to brackets. And they also use brackets for like the blaster rifle for the Hoth Commander and for Luke Hoth. So there's certain cases that AFA uses where they use these brackets instead of the recessed case. Again, in general, I tend to not like the brackets. I just think it's not as clean of a presentation. You can't see the whole weapon inside. This is a Long Eye Tubes AFA 80 Plus, by the way, for the Tusken Raider. But, it depends on how you look at it. But when it comes to size of the case, that's something else to factor in as to whether if you've got enough display space, because CAS cases in general, they're probably tied with UKG in terms of width for the cases. AFA tends to get it a little tighter, a little more compact, and they're really nice. But they also do use the rounded dowels that you see here for the Sand People and really for almost all their figures. They use these kind of rounded dowels. And my experience is that they don't stay on very well. I've seen a rash of recent figures be listed on eBay where one of those dowels has broken off in transit back from AFA, and the seller then dumps it on eBay in an auction starting at $1 because it's broken inside. And now that AFA is not recasing or even taking new submissions for loose graded figures, if you have anything in process and it comes back with a broken dowel, I'm not sure you can get it fixed right now. Or if you buy an already graded figure on eBay right now, a loose graded figure that's AFA graded, and the figure breaks or the dowels around the neck break in shipping, then you could have a problem. You'd have to either send it back to the seller and ask for a refund, or take it as is and live with it, because AFA again is not taking new submissions for recasing or for or brand new loose submissions. So it just seems like lately there have been a lot of broken dowels for those the piece that holds the head in. And also I'll point out for larger figures like the Gamorrean Guard, that's very heavy, is that these dowels, if they're not appropriately sized, what happens is the figure jostles in shipping and moves forward and is not secured by these dowels, and then it starts rubbing against the front of the case. So I've got a Gamorrean Guard like that, where the head kind of came loose because the dowel was not quite appropriately sized. And again, that goes back to my CAS preference with these J-hooks. Unless the J-hook breaks in shipping, which has not happened to me ever for any loose submissions I've sent to them, it's a much more secure type of thing on the top of the figure around the shoulders versus those dowels that are rounded. And if they're not appropriately, if they can just be off by a couple of millimeters, that figure can start bouncing towards the front of the case. So it's just something else to keep in mind. But AFA cases certainly are regarded as the most desirable since they have the strictest grading standards. And in general, AFA graded figures do sell for a slight premium, depending on the figure, versus CAS and UKG loose graded figures. That's not always the case. I've seen loose graded rare figures from UKG or CAS that command at or the same or above AFA graded examples. So for rare figures, it almost doesn't matter. For common figures as well, I did a video a while back where I looked at very, very common, standard licensed Hong Kong figures graded by CAS and AFA. And there was a slight premium for AFA figures most of the time, but not significant. And so again, it just depends on a number of different factors. Obviously, the broader economic environment, what the collectibles market is doing, who's looking at that auction at a particular time, what the grade is, what variant it is. All of those can factor into resale value. But in general, I think we can all agree that AFA graded figures are the strictest in terms of grading standards, and in general tend to sell for a slight premium, sometimes a significant premium on certain figures like Luke Farm Boys, Princess Leia's, Last 17 figures, very specific kind of figures. So just depends. Now let's dig into UKG figures. So UKG, as I mentioned, they just recently, over the last year or so, moved over to laser cut cases. They used to have, much more rudimentary cases, but have since moved over to cases that I think are directly comparable to CAS and AFA. And this is an example of one that I think I picked up from Rogue 5 Toys. And this is a standard Hong Kong Dengar graded UKG 85%. They have elected to go with the rounded dowels to mimic AFA cases. And again, I have never had any break off. I very rarely see them break off in shipping. They are a little bit larger than the dowels used by AFA. So you can see the size difference in that dowel versus the AFA dowels around the neck. And maybe that keeps it more secure. I don't know. Maybe it keeps the figure more secure. Maybe it also gives this area on the back a little bit larger area in order to attach properly to the back of the acrylic case. And so they don't tend to break off as much. I've had UKG figures shipped from the UK, so international shipping, where it can be bounced around a lot in international shipping, and I've never had anything break. So to me, I do think that with the larger dowels, there's an advantage there, to prevent the breakage that seems to be very, very prevalent with AFA cases. And also, I'll point the reason I brought out this Dengar specifically is because this is one of those larger rifles that CAS and I think AFA also, they use brackets now for this larger blaster rifle that comes with Dengar's figure versus the recessed case that UKG uses. And I think that UKG has the right way to go. To my knowledge, all of their new cases do not use any brackets. They use recessed cases for the accessories, for every single accessory for licensed figures. That's to my knowledge. I'm not guaranteeing that, but that's what I think is the case. And I just think it looks a lot cleaner. You can see the entire weapon on both sides without any brackets blocking that accessory. So you can check out the mold on that accessory. And I know that's getting very nitpicky, but in general, I just think it's much more secure. It doesn't bounce around or jostle around inside because of those brackets. So the other thing I'll point out is that there is a little bit of bubbling going on with the recessed accessory, at least on this one. And we'll take a look at the Obi-Wan in a second to talk about sabers. But so I think that if I was going to give any advice to UKG, it was to maybe get these a little bit cleaner in terms of how they and how they attach these recessed cases to the back of the case so there's less bubbling. Because if you look at AFAs, there is bubbling as well. I'm not trying to say there's not, but it seems to be maybe a little bit cleaner overall in terms of how it attaches. So that's something else to keep in mind. I do feel like the seams on all of them are fairly comparable. If we do a close-up of the seams for the actual outside of the cases, I think you can probably argue that they're all about the same, with potentially UKGs maybe being a little bit less clean, or CAS is maybe a little bit less clean as well versus AFAs, but I think it's nitpicking. I think in general the seams on the outsides of the cases are actually pretty good for all three of them. Now, I told you I was going to rank these, but before I do that, I wanted to just really quickly talk about sabers, because I like how AFA and UKG present sabers. They use a separate case like that. It's especially important for double telescoping sabers, and I wish this was a double telescoping Obi-Wan. That would be a really expensive item, especially in a UKG 85%, but this is just a standard saber, no COO, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I picked this up late last year. And I just think that in general, using this type of style is much better versus including the weapon or the saber inside the hand for presentation. The default display at CAS is to include the saber inside the hand. So unless you specifically request it when you submit to CAS, they will encase like a Luke Skywalker, a Obi-Wan Kenobi, or a Darth Vader. I'm talking about first 12 figures. They will encase those with the saber inside the hand. My personal opinion is that there's more chances for the tip of the saber to break off somehow in shipping, because that saber tip is kind of loose inside the case. So my recommendation to CAS is to do away with that. And that's to only present it this way, the way AFA and UKG do. UKG always and AFA always presents it in this style, to my knowledge now. So that would be my recommendation to CAS to do that as well. But they may not. They may not, take my advice. It's a lot easier and I'm sure cheaper to do it the other way. But I just think in general, it opens up a can of worms that, let's say somebody has a really rare, Lily Letty, Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's like a CAS 90 grade. And then that tip of the saber breaks off, and that's a very specific saber that's only unique to PvP and Lily Letty Obi-Wan Kenobis. Well, if that tip breaks off, then that that owner now has to go find a new saber. So I just think that they need to move over to this recessed case for all sabers. That would be my advice to CAS, which they can either take or leave or just ignore me. But that's my personal opinion. Now, I did say I was going to look at these three cases and give you my pick as to how I rank them. And my personal opinion is they all have different advantages and disadvantages. My personal opinion is that UKG, as of right now, has the best loose graded action figure cases on the market, in my opinion. And I think it's mainly because of how they present accessories. I also like the larger dowels. I prefer the J-hooks from CAS versus the dowels that AFA and UKG use. But if you're going to do it, at least use the larger dowels that keep the figure more secure, and the dowels are less likely to break off in shipping, either from the grading companies or on the resale market. So if I had to pick, there's advantages and disadvantages to everybody, but if I had to pick right now, the loose graded figure cases for UKG are my favorites. Now let's finish the video off talking about baggies, because I do think that's kind of fun to talk about, and all three cases are so significantly different that I think it's worth showing. So the first one is a CAS case. This is one I got back either earlier this year or late last year, but this is a SWA baggie Bosk orange head, graded 80. So this is like the mail away baggie Bosk. Now CAS uses like a second square inside of the grading case to hold the baggie in place. It does move around a little bit, so keep that in mind. AFA, this is how they basically have graded all baggies, and nothing's changed. This is my Meccano sales sample baggie for Bush, and this is graded 80 plus. So Meccano free figure sticker. And so this is a pretty rare one. I like this one a lot. But AFA tends to just have a single kind of encapsulation with a little bar on the left-hand side to kind of keep it from moving very much. So this moves a lot less than the CAS baggies, but it's maybe doesn't, I don't know if it really presents as well. In my opinion, the CAS case presents better than the AFA case. And then finally, UKG does present baggies two different ways. They have a deluxe version, which is what you see here, for my ROTJ-H Bush baggie. This is the much more elaborate case. To me, this presents like a piece of art, but it's a lot larger. And if you don't have the space for it, you got to keep that in mind. But basically what they do is they use little brackets to hold the baggie 100% in place. And then they have a little clear piece that goes over the front that's held in place by large dowels. I personally love the UKG baggie presentation for their deluxe baggies. They also do offer this style though, the same style that AFA uses for all baggies. They do, UKG does offer this, and it's a lot less expensive to grade versus this one. Keep that in mind, is that UKG does have two different presentation styles. This is the deluxe case. I personally love this case because I think it elevates the baggie to almost a piece of art, and I just think it's a true piece. Everyone uses that stupid term, piece. Well, this elevates a simple baggie into an art piece. Other collectors out there that hate that kind of presentation, they don't like this. They think it's too large and it just takes up too much space. Chris W. over at Rogue 5 Toys is an example of someone who does not like this. He hates the UKG presentation for these. So it just depends on the collector and what your tastes are. But for my money, if I was going to take a baggie and in some other alternate universe, UKG was easier to submit to, and it was closer, I probably would take every single baggie I've got and I'd send it to UKG because I think this is an awesome presentation. But it's not without its, detractions as well. So I think that, if I'm going to rank the three and I'm going to factor in space, then I'd probably take CAS's presentation. But the only big negative of CAS's presentation is that the baggie moves around too much. But I think in terms of space versus, presenting it like a piece of art, I think this presents the best. AFA's, in my opinion, presents the least. I mean, this is probably the rarest of the three baggies I've got on display here. This is a pretty tough to find Meccano sales sample baggie. So this was only available in France. And this is by far, the most valuable of the three baggies here, but it presents the worst, in my opinion. So balancing out space constraints and everything else, I think I'd probably take CAS's first. But for my money, if I lived in the UK or in Europe, I'd probably send all my baggies to UKG for these deluxe cases if I had the space to handle those. So anyway, I just thought we would kind of talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of all the different loose graded figure cases as well as baggie cases. And if you enjoyed this presentation and you want me to do one for Mint on Cards, because I now have the updated card, the Mint on Card cases for AFA, CAS, obviously, since I send so much to them, and UKG, since I did get a UKG graded TVC recently from Boss Bounty. So if you guys think that would be valuable, I'd be happy to rank those as well, because I have pretty firm opinions on that right now, and I'd like to present them if you guys found this valuable. If you hated this video, let me know that as well, and I won't bother making that video. So thanks again for watching, and I'll be back soon.